Today's guest is a critically acclaimed author who has written a number of books on what I deem fascinating topics. He's appeared on countless programmes such as Coast to Coast AM and the Gralien Report, amongst others. Please give a massive Koit welcome to Joshua Cutchin. KoitCast! Hello, Joshua. Welcome to KoitCast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure having you here. Hey, look, first off, I just want to say I love your podcast policy. I saw it on your website where you say things like, no podcast too small. It tells me a lot about you, that you're willing just to enjoy the conversation. And by the way, you can swear. All right, I'm not a prude in any way, shape or form.
Excellent. Okay.
I suppose my first question to you should be this. Can you tell me about your life journey and what led you to where you are today, researching all these glorious topics?
Oh my goodness. Well, I have a little bit of a circuitous backstory, I suppose. I was always I was a band geek in high school. But the only person that was encouraging me to go into music was my band director. Everybody else said that I should go into writing, all my other teachers. So I, for better or worse, ended up pursuing the music direction. A degree in performance from the University of Wisconsin, and made my way down to the University of Georgia for my graduate work. Again, music performance.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up having some performance injuries, basically, in my chops that made that path not as tenable. I've since figured out what was going on, and now I've got an entirely separate career in music that's I'm really happy with. But at the time, the classical route, where everybody's scrutinizing what you're playing with a score and keeping track of all these mistakes, didn't really seem like something that was going to be possible. So I was able to parlay that stipend and tuition waiver that I got at the University of Georgia into a music literature degree, which is like a musicology degree where you're spending a lot of time looking through old scores and doing things like footnoting and endnoting. But then I had the bright idea, well, how about I get some sort of degree in journalism as well? So I also got a master's degree in journalism because the original plan was to be an arts journalist of some description, maybe a critic, although I don't think I'm qualified for that. But so I had a little short career in arts PR at the University of Georgia. I got hired by my alma mater to run the PR for the School of Music, and it was like having 60 bosses. 60
Never
bosses.
good.
60 bosses who are all artists. So, as an artist myself, like, I'm not slamming artists, but as an artist myself, we are very particular about the way we want things done. And we all think that what we're doing is the most important thing. So when you're being pulled in that many different directions, it just became an untenable situation. So I coincided my departure from my day job with the release of my first book. And that probably deserves a little bit of preamble as well. I always grew up as a monster kid. These sort of things were not frowned upon in my household. I grew up Christian, but it was a very open Christian household in the sense that there wasn't this stigma that you see amongst a lot of evangelicals today of like no dealing with ghosts, no dealing with monsters or anything. My parents always had the outlook that as long as he's reading, let him read whatever he wants to. So I did gravitate towards, especially cryptozoology books and Bigfoot and stuff like that. So I'd always had this sort of interest. And then when I got my day job, it was an hour commute. And that would have been 2012. So that was kind of when a lot of these podcasts were popping off. And I was just mainlining these podcasts for 2 hours, 5 days a week. And just listening to all this stuff and really getting up to speed on the history. And I finally, I'd always kept the UFO topic at an arm's length, but I heard some alternatives to the extraterrestrial hypothesis that made me reconsider it because I had some basic logic problems with the extraterrestrial hypothesis that I couldn't get around. And I know you've spoken to Mike Clellan, so you're at least familiar with some of the alternative thinking that's happening in that space. But so I just got really interested in this stuff, and I'll never forget. I was, doing my day job, and I got a gift card from my sister-in-law for, $20, $25 from Amazon or something like that. And I said, I'm going to indulge myself and read a Bigfoot book, buy a Bigfoot book. And that book that I purchased was J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, which is a wonderful book. It does approach the topic of Bigfoot as a flesh and blood creature, but thankfully pays a lot of respect and attention to indigenous testimony. And I distinctly remember reading about some of the Alaskan tribes' belief in Bigfoot and how they described that amongst one Bigfoot analog, the Bequus, if you were to receive food from the Bequus and you were to take it, you would be trapped with the Bequus forever. And what's more, this food that they gave you appeared to be dried salmon, but was actually made to look that way. It was actually in reality tree bark. And this really made a connection for me for whatever reason. Like this is the big bang of Josh being involved in the
Yeah.
paranormal and writing books, because I'd always remembered that bit of Western European fairy folklore that if you go to fairyland and you are offered something to eat or drink, don't take it because you'll be trapped there forever. And I just was so struck by the similarity of that and this basically Bigfoot legend from the New World, two places that supposedly have no pre-Columbian contact. And it really left me with, three possibilities. One, that things like the collective unconscious and archetypes are very real, where ideas appear in cultures independent of actually any contact or transmission. Or two, that there was more contact between the old and new worlds than we really acknowledge. Or three, which is obviously the one that I'm most sympathetic to or most interested in, is that these are two populations that arrived at similar conclusions because they're dealing with something objective. And while I'm always very skeptical of any given cultures, including modern cultures, interpretations of these phenomena, I do think a lot of the same beats you see over and over again that do hint at something objectively real going on. Now, whether again, which of those three options it is that I listed, I'm not sure, but it does suggest that there's something more than just, just stories or just mythology. There's these beats that get hit time and time again. So I sat back and I said, somebody should write a book on that. And it took me a moment to realize that this was this is kind of you, Josh. So I was a very naughty boy and used the summer at the university to basically write my first book because
Hey,
summers.
why not?
Well, very very little stuff happens, at the university in the summer that I needed to do. So I kind of did that, and it all coincided at the same time. So then I just started teaching and playing more and working on books. And since then, it's been about 8 years, but it's finally become something that resembles a full-time job. So I feel very blessed in that regard.
Yeah, it does sound amazing. I mean, I'm looking myself to get into a position where I also quit the day job to do stuff that I love full time. And I know that's going to be amazing when I get there. A couple of things struck me from what you mentioned. First, I like the phrase "monster kid." I just want to refer to that. And I
Oh
like
yeah,
the fact that your parents and that were not strict. They didn't dissuade you from an avenue.
yeah. So I was, I was anything with a creature in it, creature features.
Yeah.
Those were my jam growing up. But yeah, my parents were always very open and loving, and to this day they remain really supportive. It kind of gets a little bit I talk to people about growing up in a Christian household and they automatically sort of jump to the worst assumptions of what that
Mm,
looked like. But it was a very open household. Like the idea that ghosts might not be real was never put in my head by my parents. It wasn't until later and I encountered, other denominations that it was like, oh no, we can't talk about ghosts, and
mm.
anything like aliens must be demons and stuff like that was never anything that I ever heard growing up.
Well, that's great because to have a limit on your imagination or whatever, or your even quests for knowledge would be a bad thing. So I love that fact. Um, and there was one other thing I want to get into, which was there was an inspiration, if you will, to spark you off onto this path. Is that
It
what you
was.
think it is? And if that is, can you almost describe that inspiration? Was it a calling? Was it just a thought you had?
Well, it's kind of funny. I recently saw some. I've been cleaning out some old diaries and such, and I do find hints of this here and there, where I'm talking about, and I believe it's August 6th. No, May, I think it's May 6th. Anyway, I made a note that it was Charles Fort's birthday, and this was sometime back in the early 2000s before I even wrote
Mm.
about this stuff. So like I see like how interested I was in it, but also I also found another note that I made to myself that said, I love writing footnotes and endnotes. What's wrong with me? And that's something that my work has since become really known for is how well it's cited. So I think that this kind of was an undercurrent, um, you know, running through this whole thing. And really like my desire to write about this was born out of a desire to read about these topics. But when you're faced with something that no one has written, and you're kind of like, well, maybe I am being called to do this in some regard. So yeah, it does feel like a natural fit, and to that extent, I for whatever reason, and this isn't me bragging, I'm actually kind of ashamed of it. I have a really good retention for a lot of this stuff, and I don't know why. I can't remember
Why are you
something that my
ashamed of that?
well, I can't remember what my child said last night, and I can't tell you what I had for dinner 2 nights ago, but I can tell you about, I can remember this obscure bit of folklore from Papua New Guinea or something. It's just, so I feel like I kind of wish I had a little bit more retention for things that are happening in my life, but for some reason, there's a hole in my brain that just slots perfectly with this subject matter, and I guess gives me some degree of recall.
You are not alone there because I am almost exactly the same.
Okay, good.
I
So,
don't have kids to forget
yeah.
their birthdays or anything, but other dates, I'm the same. All this sort of like paranormal shenanigans, I love, and I could say, "Oh, I heard that on Coast to Coast," or this, that, and the other.
Yeah. I mean, my wife is the kind of person who remembers to this day in 2023, she remembers phone numbers, which I don't find a lot of people remember. She remembers phone numbers and bank account numbers and all just numbers. And it's in one ear and out the other for me.
Well, fair play to you. I think life is a calling of some variety. I've had a number of conversations with people, and I think this is the way my thinking is going. That ultimately there's a fatal path for all of us, and we're not going to escape it.
It does seem that way. And I've talked with my wife since I made that choice, because you want to talk about a big conversation to have. It's like, hey, I think I want to quit my day job that we're getting health insurance through and just teach music and play tuba and and write about aliens and Bigfoot and such. Like that's a very sobering conversation, because it also, I mean, I arrived at that decision after applying for some other jobs and not making it past the final round. There were some really promising positions that I sort of made it through a couple of rounds of interviews, and then I just think at some point they just sort of Googled the fact that, and
Oh, right.
they
Oh,
Googled me
okay.
and they saw that I'd written this book, and it's kind of like, oh, we've got a nut job here. So yeah, there is sort of a stigma that sort of you get stuck with in that regard. So yeah, but it was, even though it was a tough decision or a life altering decision, we both agree that it's just something I should have done a long time ago, and I wish that I had done it a long time ago.
Mm.
Because just I do love the freedom of being self-employed, and as of right now, I've even cut out the music teaching part of it, and I just am playing and writing, and it's I couldn't have crafted something that fits my personality better. So I really have to pinch myself now and again, and the fact that not only am I able to do this, but that again, my work has been so well received. And I say that not to brag, but to say that like I'm getting feedback, and I'm on a first name basis with people whose books I read in middle school, as a
Mm.
monster kid. It's just such a surreal thing to me. That I really do have to do a reality check every now and then and say this is where I wound up, and the community's been really supportive as well. So
It's where you wound up, but presumably always also, sorry, where you meant to be, where you're meant to be.
exactly, yeah, I feel like I was sort of fighting whatever this is, because I didn't really think it was an option. I remember being
Mm.
a little kid, and being like, "Mommy, Daddy, I want to be a cryptozoologist one day," and they're like, "There's no, you can't do that, son. Like, that's not a
Yeah,
real job."
that don't
Um,
pay.
yeah. But somehow I kind of ended up there. So like before I was I wanted to be a zoo veterinarian at one point, and I wanted to be a musician, obviously, at one point. And but even before all that, it was being, a monster hunter. And I'm kind of in there. I don't do as much field work as I'd like, but I'm kind of in that space, and it's kind of remarkable to me. Yeah.
I know. Last thought before we burst into your books, right? Which
Mhm.
is it? is your life like one of those romantic comedies, right, whereby a woman's walking, she's meant to go into a job or something, and someone spills coffee on her, and then she turns around and there's her new bloke, right? Were your interviews like that, where something stopped you from going, or you know, you gave a wrong answer accidentally or something?
I mean, I kind of suspect that. There are aspects of my personality that don't fit well into an office culture or a corporate culture. Just in terms of uh how I like to run my schedule and just all sorts of things like that. So I do feel like there is sort of I am sort of being pushed in that direction, and the fact that it just a lot of this is something that I'm thinking about sort of instilling in my sons. We have twin boys, is that you shouldn't do things because they're easy, right? You shouldn't just pick something because it's easy, but at the same time, if you notice that you have an aptitude for something and that you can sort of leapfrog ahead of where other people might start at that, then that might be a good choice for you. Whatever it is, being an electrician or
Mm.
things like. You think I wanted to play tuba? Like I didn't want to play tuba, but something about my facial structure and the sort of natural inclination that I had towards that instrument, plus the fact that I'm a big guy who can carry the darn thing, sort of put me down that path and allowed me to sort of leapfrog. So I was like, well, if I'm going to be good at something, I might as well just go all into this and be successful at it. So
And they used
that's
to call you tuba lips in high school, didn't they?
yeah. I mean, that was my. I think my band director was just lacking tuba players, and he was like, oh, you got a trombone? No, tuba lips. That's it. You're big. Yeah, you got tuba. Yeah,
You're
totally.
in.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
So yeah, it's just finding that, not the path of least resistance, but finding something that you really resonate with and you don't have to fight against so much.
yeah, and definitely something that feels fulfilling.
Yes. Yeah, and I can definitely say that. I mean, I'm also of the opinion that no matter what you do, you're going to find ways to complain about it. One of my
Oh
favorite
yeah.
cartoon strips that I've ever seen is it was a picture of a concert pianist sitting at the keyboard, and the bottom caption says, "How to tell if you're a true professional," and the thought bubble says, "I hate this." and it is kind of that. You'll always find ways to complain about things, but sometimes I have to give myself a gut check and say, look, you're writing about Atlantis or werewolves or whatever the topic happens to be. And yeah, that's like, just shut up, Josh, and and do the work,
And
because
do.
this is exactly what you want. Yeah.
I'm not a writer, and I can write, but I choose not to because I can't do too much of that writing and reading stuff, right? Which makes me sound weird, but it's for a
No, I
reason.
totally get it.
I'm creative musically and I make animations and stuff, right? And I
Mhm.
know what you mean, because it's you want to be creative, you want to do it, you're going to be fulfilled when you do it, but the chore of actually doing the work can put you off the thing you love, but you always end up going back to it.
Yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
to that degree, you're talking about different aptitudes that people have. I mean, in terms of like sound production, and basic memorization of certain aspects of performance, um, I did have a natural inclination to be a musician, but it's not like some of the friends that I have who can literally pick up any brass instrument and just figure it out on the fly.
Mm.
So I've had to work at music a lot more than I've had to work at writing, which isn't to say that I haven't improved at writing, but like there's something about reading as so much as a kid that you sort of build a glossary and index and vocabulary of stuff and tools and tricks in your head that I just is a little bit more natural for me. So I used to say musician author, and now I'm like author musician, because the focus has shifted a
That's,
little bit, even
yeah,
though I still
taking your
play a lot.
primary
Yeah.
slot.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's branch into your books then. And we're
All
going to
right.
start with your first book, I believe you said, which is A Trojan Feast:
Mhm.
The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch. Have I got that right?
Yes, that is perfect.
1 point. I'm going to just throw this open to you, and you can tell us anything about it, and then hopefully you can give us some cases or stories from that book. Anything to inspire us.
Well, I uh I think a lot about that book now, because I kind of cringe whenever I see people reading it, because now, six or so books later, it's like there's a lot of stuff I change about that. Just the benefit of experience, but it was directly spurned on from that connection that I noted, of this sort of food taboo, that I noticed between some of these indigenous Alaskan tribes and Western Europe. And you dig on that a little bit, you dig into it, and you start to see that this subject of accepting something to eat or drink in an other world, whatever that might be, the underworld, spirit world, whatever you want to call it, is a very pervasive myth and a very pervasive taboo across the world. And the general consensus amongst folklorists who don't entertain the possibility that there is some sort of supernatural reality is that it's all derived from the Persephone myth, where she goes to the underworld and she's about to escape the underworld, but Hades has given her a cursed pomegranate seed, and she eats the pomegranate seed, and for the remainder of her days, she's trapped. The underworld is her home base. And I can totally buy that if you're looking at a diaspora out of Europe into these other places. But I can't get behind that as the origin point for this, when you do see it in North America, and you do see it in South America, and you do see it in Oceania. Again, unless we're entertaining these ideas that there was a lot more travel and commerce between these different populations that are also spreading ideas. But to me, it just seemed to suggest that there was something perhaps objectively real going on there. So the book ends up being a deep dive on that particular aspect of mythology, for lack of a better term, but it also fit nicely at the time into a very underexamined aspect of a lot of these paranormal encounters. And you'll find these from time to time, and it's kind of what I've based a lot of my work on, is people will note things. They'll note something like, with my second book, they'll note smells, and they might devote a sentence or even at the most a paragraph to it, and then they'll go on their merry way. And you sit back and you say, wait, we're dealing with a mystery that we really know nothing about. Maybe you should unpack that one aspect a little bit more. So that ended up being the goal of the Trojan Feast, was to take a look at the types of foods and drinks and things like that, that allegedly are exchanged during these encounters between the witnesses and the entities or beings. I know some people would probably question why I lumped aliens, fairies, and Bigfoot into one book, but the more I look at the paranormal, the more I'm convinced that these things are somehow related. The most extreme way to put it would be that it's all one phenomenon that wears different masks. Another way to say it would be that these things all just sort of use the same techniques. The Venn diagrams overlap a bit, but a cogent case has been made that the modern UFO experience is dealing with the same thing that you see from Western European fairy folklore. And if you take a broader look, a lot of fairy folklore or little people folklore that you'll find in every population on every inhabited continent. I mean, in North America, the indigenous people have these robust legends around little people, and you'll find some of the same things. You'll find, in some instances, you'll find the food taboo. You'll find that they like abducting people. They tend to live underground. Like, you'll see the same things happening over and over again. So we're not talking about Tinkerbell or anything like that. That's kind of a Victorian kind of children's book idea. But just this sort of robust ecosystem of spirits or of intelligences that seem to exist, and that seems to be what a lot of the UFO phenomena is dealing with. And I could go through a laundry list of the similarities, but I won't get bogged down in that. So what did I sort of learn from? I tried doing this sort of quantitative data analysis of the types of food and drink exchanged, and I think that approach had some successes and some failures. The problem is that you're always sort of working with an incomplete data set when you're talking about these topics, because it's scattered across 150 different sources at best,
and a shed load of years.
Yeah, exactly. And then, where you draw the distinctions between what certain types of entities are and what these sort of foods that are brought to people are, is kind of gets fuzzy as well. But I did note some rough trends, where that it seemed that the most commonly offered things in a lot of these encounters tended to be milk, bread, and juice. Again, setting aside the idea that it actually is any of those things, because who knows, but
Mm.
that's the way that they tended to be described. Um, and what was really interesting to me is that if you sort of arrange the categories of food that are offered in these encounters, you'll find milk, bread, juice, fruits, vegetables, and like sort of meats and candies and things are kind of low at the bottom. And I don't know if this has any bearing on what's actually going on, but that same sort of order seems to closely resemble this Ayurvedic tradition of what's called the Sattvic diet, which is sort of a diet that you would see used amongst mystics and yogis and whatnot, to sort of help elevate your consciousness. And that's one thing that goes greatly under discussed in UFO contact, is the fact that people after contact have poltergeist effects, and they have um, you know clairvoyance to some degree. Like a lot of
Mm.
what we would call psi phenomena tend to unfold in the wake of these encounters. So you've got this group of people in the UFO experiencers who seem to be experiencing this extended consciousness realm, and you've also got this diet that's associated with the UFO phenomena that closely resembles people who are, you know, spiritual leaders in a sense. I sort of wondered if there was some sort of comparison there, but it was also useful to see how, you know, a lot of these UFO encounters do seem to mirror those fairy encounters in terms of the way that food and drink are offered. A famous example that I'll provide from the book is
Cool.
the an encounter from the 1960s. It's one of my favorite stories. You might have heard it before. It's kind of a laughable story, but it was investigated by J. Allen Hynek and some military officials who, to varying degrees, at the very least, thought that the witness was credible. And he had some physical proof to prove it. So in the 1960s, I can't remember the precise year, Joe Simonton, a chicken farmer from Eagle River, Wisconsin, was in this kitchen when he heard the sound of what he described similar to wet tires on pavement, or tires on wet pavement. And it's sort of this object, this silver, almost chrome, inverted bowl shaped object descends onto his property. And he goes outside, and this hatch opens, and there's several men that Simonton described as appearing as though they were Mediterranean. They were short fellows with in these sort of full body uniforms with some tight fitting caps. And he notices that they are holding up this jug, this silver jug. And Simonton, in some of his interviews, he talks about not being able to look in the eyes of these beings or people, because it's so, their gaze so profoundly affected him. But he takes the jug and intuitively knows that they want water. So he goes down to I think he had a pump in the basement, and he goes down and he fills up the water and brings it back up. And as he brings it back up and hands it over to them, he notices that they are operating a device that looks like some sort of flameless griddle, and on it are these little cookies or pancakes, or have you heard the story?
I have, and the
Okay.
pancake thing just spurred my mind.
Yeah, the pancake
Yeah.
thing. So there's sort of this implied sort of exchange where they notice him noticing this,
Hmm.
and they give him several of these little pancakes, which you can see plenty of pictures of Joe Simonton with these things. They're not very big at all. They're porous, and he said he tasted them. They tasted awful. They tasted like cardboard, and he said, no wonder they're so small if that's what they eat.
Probably
During
was cardboard, yeah.
Yeah, and Simonton was like a well-regarded figure in the community. He used to, dress up as Santa for the children every Christmas, and he was just regarded as a very down-to-earth fellow. And then they just close up their spaceship and toddle off, or soar off, I guess, with their water. And it's so absurd. You know, I fully acknowledge that. A lot of that the UFO stuff in the 50s and 60s sounds absurd. But if you take it from the perspective of a comparative folklorist, you start to see some really interesting things emerge. I mean, number one, he had something from the encounter, which implies a certain degree of reality. They were analyzed, and they were determined to just contain mundane earthly ingredients like buckwheat, flour, but no salt. And the French ufologist Jacques Vallée talked about this extensively in his 1969 book, Passport to Magonia. where he pointed out, and I think rightly so, in making a case for the similarity between the older fairy folklore and the newer UFO stuff, that buckwheat has a strong association with stories involving fairies, especially if you look in some stories from France that involve the luton. But also, the lack of salt was very curious, because it's something that we use in a lot of baked goods, and there wasn't any in this. And there's that bit of folklore that you find in a lot of different fairy stories, that they have an aversion to salt, which again, Vele thought that was interesting. What I found was equally striking. In fact, I think to a degree it was more impactful to me doing my own research on this. There's some islands off the coast of Germany. I believe they're called the Friesland Islands. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but there is a group of dwarves in the folklore from those islands known as the Unerbanski or Unerbansk. And one of the things that they do is they help farmers who are working in the field by bringing them fresh water and pancakes. I just thought that was such an
it's an interesting link.
It's an interesting link, and that's the kind of thing that I run into sometimes. That's what I really find the most fascinating is when you have somebody who is a chicken farmer in 1960s Wisconsin saying something that resonates with a body of folklore that he probably heard nothing about. You see this from time to time. You see somebody in the middle of Iowa who says something that sounds like it's pulled straight from an ancient Mesopotamian text or something before the era of the internet. And it's like, is there actually some sort of reality between these two things that people are tapping into? I don't know. But so that was sort of the background, and obviously I go in a couple of different directions with the Trojan Feast, but that's kind of the general thrust of that book.
So is it just because I haven't read your book, and I apologize for that. I'm just not one for reading books, if I'm honest.
I totally understand.
I do what you used to do, listen to a load of podcasts all the time. That's how I garner my information. It's because it's how I learn the best. No, I've literally just lost the train of thought I
had. You're asking like what the book. So the book is in all my books.
The style of book. Is it just a collection of stories that then?
No.
Or okay, cool.
So none of my books are just a collection of stories, because I feel like there always needs to be like a so what. What can we learn from?
Perfect.
So while there are plenty of stories, it's always this balancing act between presenting these stories and presenting enough to show a trend in one regard or another, but also like being able to extract some type of analysis from it and say, well, here are some different examples. If you look again at if you take the comparative folklore approach, in the sort of comparative religious approach, and sort of looking at what the implications of these stories, again with a giant caveat if true, what the implications of these stories might say about the broader phenomenon. So, where I sort of ended up going with that book is that there's this sort of concept of that you'll see in a variety of cultures, of eating the god, of like which is we've all seen like the sort of the ideas of in some of the pulp novels and stuff of cannibals eating human beings to take on their attributes,
take on their power.
And it's sort of a variation on that idea that if you eat a piece of the god, you become more godly. And there's a lot to unpack with that ends up taking you into the root of things like ayahuasca, which are in some cultures at once plant, drink, and deity. So it's this idea of consuming to become closer, and you sort of see the fingerprints of that across some of the UFO stuff in particular.
Now, do you think, obviously in the case you just mentioned of the pancake chap, we're going to call him Pancake Chap from now on. That isn't really what I would call an offer, because I thought where your book will be going, and I'm sure a load of the stories will be, is dealing with temptation of some variety. Like the old adamant apple, that sort of thing.
Well, that was the most interesting thing that I sort of found out about the book, is that there very rarely in the UFO literature, at least, is a prohibition on taking the stuff. I did find like one account from Russia, and it's interesting. I've talked with some of my friends in Latin America about this. The accounts from Russia and the accounts from South America and Mexico are always a little bit more dramatic than the American accounts. And I'm not saying that to say that I think that these populations are making it up. I'm saying that I think that the phenomenon changes to adapt to the sensibilities of certain populations. But he agreed with that. He's like, yeah, he said these Mexican accounts are always a lot more interesting than the American ones.
Do you think that
Um,
is though also because they're probably not as suppressed mentally,
yeah,
i.e.,
well, this,
you know,
yeah,
that veil of secrecy and all that malarkey and the
yeah,
mockery isn't there. Is it?
yeah. There was an anthropologist named Vince, I believe it's I forget his name, and I don't want to misspeak, but it is an idea that has been circulated in anthropological circles where people entertain the possibility of magic. That populations that believe in magic experience magic more often. And so because they don't have that sort of filtered out.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
certainly see this in the work of uh, you know uh, Cynthia Hind, who brought us a lot of African UFO accounts into the West through her work as well. So anyway, but in one of those Eastern European accounts, I did find one of the entities saying, "If you eat this, you'll have to stay with us forever," which is like the most direct, explicit version of that food
Mm.
taboo. But for the most part, people are just given things, and it's interesting to see how the quality of exchange is sort of reflected in the broader flavor of the experience. What I mean by that specifically is if you look at sort of the contactee era, that 50s, 60s era where it's all, space brothers and it all is very voluntary and they're like, come aboard my ship and I'll take you on an adventure to the stars. Those are always offerings. Like, would you like to eat this?
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
once the alien abduction narrative, the abductee narrative takes hold in the, mid 70s, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, it becomes a lot more consent gets removed, I guess you'd say, because it's, we're taking you and we are forcing things down your throat, or we're injecting you with stuff, which I would argue is sort of a variation on that sort of, food exchange idea. So yeah, it's interesting to see how everything about the encounters changes as that character changes, which I still really don't know why that shift happened. I mean, there were some personalities who were pushing the alien abduction nefarious angle. But I suspect that maybe something in the zeitgeist uh, of the world, or at the very least Western culture, also played a role. And that's something that I've sort of come to accept as I've looked at this topic through a bunch of different lenses, is that we are playing a role in whatever this is. I think that this phenomenon slash these phenomena adapt to the culture and adapt to the expectations of wherever they appear. You can see this specifically in the UFO topic because once we had chariots and sailing ships in the skies, and then that was sort of the paradigm for the longest time. And then around the turn of the 20th century, you've got these steampunk airships. It always just stays a little
Mm.
bit ahead of our technology. So steampunk airships in the early 20th century, and then in the 50s, you get these wonderful, not art
Art
deco,
Deco. Yeah. Oh,
but
that's 20s, isn't it?
I guess art nouveau maybe.
Art Nouveau. Yeah, that's it.
I was about to say art neco, but that's not a thing. Art nouveau or art deco flying saucers. Um, and then, in the 80s, you get these black triangles that prefigure the stealth bomber, or were the stealth bomber being, misidentified.
Mm.
And then, nowadays we've got these luminous balls of plasma that are about the size of drones, or are more drone size. So if you reject the idea that people are just making this stuff up, there does seem to be um, a cultural component that's affecting the way that these things appear. Sort of a quasi Lovecraftian idea. There's something that we can't perceive, and we're meeting it halfway with our own
It is weird, isn't it? It's like we are reacting to their reaction, and or vice versa. It's just odd.
Mhm.
Both things are
And,
interacting.
right, and I want to be clear, since we're so far down the rabbit hole on this. Like, I retain a lot of agnosticism about exactly what this stuff is. I do think that something is happening to people, and people aren't just all liars, hoaxers, or you know, um, mistaken. But at the same time, it's hard to discuss these topics if you keep having to interject, if there's anything to it, if you keep having to interject and undermine your argument. So we'll just proceed as if these things seem to be real. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
So that's a Trojan feast, I guess. Yeah.
Well, let's go into because I'm interested in the alien side of things primarily. I mean, I want to hit Sasquatch, and we'll go into that on your next book. And I'm wearing a Sasquatch
Oh,
t-shirt
nice,
in
nice.
honor, which I picked up a
Lovely.
couple of weeks ago in
Yeah.
Port Angeles,
Oh, okay.
in your fair country. Yeah, so aliens and some more offerings of food, because I don't think I've heard too many of these. So are there any
Oh,
more?
yeah. I'm trying to think. It's been so long since I've talked specifically about a Trojan feast, but what you tend to see a little bit more in sort of the UFO pageantry is people being offered um, liquids and people being offered pills and things like that. Um, there are accounts of people having tubes shoved down their throat and having some sort of liquid poured in. Um, you do see every now and then, I mentioned that it was sort of an outlier, but you do see every now and then this mention of uh things like candy that
Mm.
occur in some of these stories. There was another story, I believe it was also from Russia, um, of this child who was coming back from I believe was playing tennis, perhaps, and they I try to cheat and bring up the PDF here, and
That's all
I
right. You
can't.
carry on.
Okay. Uh, yeah, so there's a story of this young boy named Maxim Zirkov, and he claimed that he was coming home from a tennis match in 1990, and he was pulled into a metallic object in the sky. Um, Once aboard the craft, he met two beings with they were wearing these helmets, and they had these sort of antenna on the helmets, and they asked him his name, and he began to see scenes of his life from back on Earth, which kind of hints at something I looked at later, which is the similarity between near-death experiences and
I was going to
UFO
say.
contact. But it's interesting, they gave him some candy of something of some sort that was taken out of like a glass tube and given to him. And he said it tasted like candle wax. And the question is like, why? Like, why would you? That was a question that I kept on running up against when I was writing Trojan Feast. Why, in these relatively short encounters, when people don't need sustenance, why are you feeding them? That's kind of weird. Is it hospitality, or is it for another agenda? And I would suspect that it's some sort of symbolic consciousness expanding sort of scenario. But even though it was in the 90s, the story of Zirkov has sort of a contactee flair, because it is sort of a very friendly encounter. But there was I believe, if memory serves, he was shown a realm of like the departed in his experience as well, which is another one of those things that blurs the lines between near-death experiences and UFO encounters, which is something that I've found more and more fascinating lately.
I find that endlessly fascinating, and I'm going to save that one for a bit later, because I think
Yeah.
one of your other books
Yes.
lends
Yeah.
or delves deep into that side of things.
Yeah.
Now, the exchange of food. I see it as two ways. One, like you mentioned, where it's a food is laced with something that does something, i.e., expands their mind, turns on an innate ability or something, or puts you to sleep or whatever. Or something that springs to mind is like when people go to, or years ago, came to America as an example, and they saw the native tribes. A way of getting to know each other would be exchange of food and stuff, wouldn't it? Without
Right.
talking and that. So is
Right.
it part of that?
And well, there's certainly a line of academic scholarship looking at this from purely a folkloric perspective that says that that is a symbol of hospitality and of peacemaking, is
Peacemaking,
sort
that's
of this
it.
exchange of food and drink. And some people think that that's actually where this sort of food taboo, as you see it across the world, stems from, is that once you sort of partake of the food from anyone else, not just supernatural beings, but you were sort of accepted as a part of the community, a part of the tribe, etc. And you do see that there's some stories from South America of where someone goes into the afterlife among some of the tribes in the Amazon. Uh, Someone goes in the afterlife to rescue a loved one, and they're warned against drinking any of the black corn. I believe it's called chicha drink, because once you do that, you're stuck there. But you'll see
Hmm.
this again. You'll see it in Africa, and you'll see it in
Let
amongst
me
the
just
indigenous
make a note of that.
Aborigines.
If
Yeah.
anyone ever offers me chicha,
Well, that
say
was the
no.
that was the thing, is because when I first got it, really when my interest in this stuff really ramped up, my wife was kind of like, "Why are you so into this?" And I'm like, "Well, it kind of is nice to have some of these little tidbits in your back pocket. I mean, what if you see a leprechaun and he offers you something to drink? Like, do you take it or not?" The answer
Hmm.
is always no. Yeah,
Yeah, here, little kiddie, would you want some of my sweets? Yeah, you keep
yeah.
away from that
Well,
sort of
yeah,
thing.
it's sort of a stranger danger book in a
It
lot of
very
ways.
much
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
So Sasquatch is part of the Trojan Feast.
Mhm.
What has he offered?
Well, it's interesting because so even though I espouse the idea that these things are related, it never lines up 100%. I would say that as compared to my second book, The Brimstone Deceit, where I looked at smells, Sasquatch fits a little bit less neatly into the sort of ideas proposed in a Trojan Feast. You do see more things like um, meat offered, which again, really low on that sattvic diet that I
Hmm.
mentioned earlier. But Is something that you do see a little bit more in the Bigfoot encounters, where people are allegedly abducted by Bigfoot. Your mileage on how real that is might vary. Um, but but you also do see no shortage of vegetables and fruit stuff offered in those Bigfoot encounters, and I don't know if this is necessarily related to this idea of the sattvic diet, but even when it's vegetables, they're often described by the witnesses as sort of being sweet tasting, and that was one of the qualitative aspects of the sattvic diet, is that it did place an emphasis on sweeter, on the sweeter end of the spectrum. So there's something to that, I perhaps. But the thing, it's kind of funny, because even though a Bigfoot analog, the book was sort of a leaping off point for me doing that study in a Trojan Feast, the actual modern day firsthand accounts don't seem to indicate that trend as strongly. It's more the things that you see in the lore of the Kwakiutl peoples and the Tlingit peoples in Alaska.
Okay. So, we'll put a line under Trojan Feast in a second. So the
Okay.
fairies,
Mhm.
you think they are aliens in the past, just seen through the lens as fairies because people didn't understand the term alien? Do you think that's what
See,
that is?
this is a point of contention for me, and I'm glad you asked it. I I don't think that aliens are fairies, and I don't think that fairies are aliens. I think that both of those terms are culture dependent ways of looking at something. If that makes any
Okay.
sense. And frankly, if I were to be more sympathetic to one or the other, I think that I would lean towards the idea that aliens are fairies. But I do think that it's just all attempts to describe this thing that's interacting with us. Because if you keep on going back down that line of thinking, you'll see that the fairies were also perhaps once minor pagan deities. Perhaps they were once the human dead, demon spirits. Like you just all these
Hmm.
these terms get really wishy washy. But the way that it behaves is super consistent. So that's why I tend to say, as far as like an objective label, I don't think we stumbled across one before. I mean, I'm of the mindset. I've been talking about this a little bit more recently, but I'm of the mindset that since the UFO phenomenon seems to be recontextualizing itself time and time again, and since we also seem very much overdue for a new recontextualization, I would not be surprised if this phenomenon begins taking on the guise of AI and begins appearing as robots that are supposedly coming from some secret underground base, because that's just the thing that we are treating as a a greater possibility. We're entertaining that idea a little bit more. So the phenomenon, whatever it is, says, okay, well, this seems to be what people can can tolerate the most. Let's look like we're these AI beings run amok. So that is really where I sort of land on it, is that I don't think that any of these descriptors are accurate. We can say what it seems to appear as, but I don't think that any of those are objective reads on what's going on. So it's a great question. I'm glad you asked that.
Well, I also like your answer because you're saying essentially that the phenomenon, whatever that may be, is constantly evolving to react to how we think of it.
Right.
As in, it's changing. If we've done 20 or 30 years thinking if it was a triangle, right? Let's become a shape. Let's become a circle. Oh, it's a circle now. In 20 years' time, let's become a hexagon. That sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like I keep on saying fairies, but I'm using that as a catch-all for the Islamic jinn
Mm.
and the Alush in South America and the Nunyanahi and the Yunwi and the southeastern United States and all these sort of different characters that you see that just sort of behave in the same way but are given different names, which is why I think at the end of the day it's either an archetype, it's just some sort of software that human beings come preloaded with, or there's something actually going on that we're all attempting to describe. And or this is also another option that I've warmed up to a little bit recently, is the idea that human beings are somehow generating this phenomenon. And I'm not saying that in the sense that we're all collectively hallucinating, but the idea that um, we're projecting a part of ourselves. People talk about things like thought forms or egregores or tulpas. I'm not sure how much
Mm.
I suspect that. I almost suspect that it's, if you look back into this, sort of treads a little bit into my more recent work, but if you look back into a lot of these older spiritual beliefs, there was this idea that we had many souls inside of us, souls that sometimes could wander about of their own volition and be seen by us. So is it something like that that's perhaps going on? I mean, a lot of these, what you find if you look at the paranormal long enough, is that a lot of these stories seem so tailor-made to the individual. They are so personal. I mean, that's something that you see throughout Mike's work as well, is that like these are things that appear in these stories that resonate with that person and that person only, which kind of makes me believe either this thing knows us better than we know ourselves, or perhaps it is somehow a part of ourselves.
Can't get your head around it, can you?
No, and that's the thing. I've been using this analogy lately. Like as soon as you think you have, and you start putting your grip on it, it sort of, sort of launches out of your fingers like a watermelon seed. If you've ever tried to pick up a watermelon seed, you really
I
can't, because
haven't,
it just,
but
yeah, it just sort of spits out of your grasp. So yeah, I and I'm of the I've also said recently, like I have three baskets in my head, one that says true, one that says false, and one that says interesting if true. And that middle basket, that interesting if true basket, is really big, and the other ones are really
mm.
small, because it's just I like to entertain a lot of different interpretations of what this could be at once, because it's still unsettled. There's been a lot of talk in the US lately of crash retrievals and perhaps dead alien bodies, but um I suspect that unless whatever that disclosure is acknowledges how strange this phenomenon seems to be and how it does seem to have something to do with human consciousness, that it's only going to be a partial disclosure at best.
Mm. As part of what you were saying there, I was thinking in my head the Skinwalker Ranch show, right? You've obviously, I would assume you've obviously seen that show. That
Yes.
gets mentioned about things reacting. It's like they're playing with us, that sort of thing. Whatever that is, if that is derived from us, creating that to then piss around with us or vice versa, I don't know, but it is weird.
Well, that's where the archetypal discussion comes in too, is that um there's been a lot of discussion of how these things seem to embody a tricksterish aspect.
Mm.
And some people sort of take that reading the wrong way, and they think that there is a deity known as the capital T trickster, and that's not necessarily what it means. It just means that um, you know, it just means that there's sort of a guiding set of principles that whatever this is seem to gravitate towards and fulfill that role, perhaps in society. But the Skinwalker Ranch stuff that you mentioned is really indicative of this idea that there seem to be fewer boundaries between these things than we would like, because that particular area of Utah has UFOs and it has balls of light and it has cryptids and it has Bigfoot and it has dog man werewolf things. It has poltergeists, it has ghosts, and so it's um as my co-author and friend Timothy Grinner said when we were writing our book on Bigfoot. He says, it's very rare to see a Bigfoot. It's rare to see a UFO. How many orders of magnitude rarer is it to see these things in conjunction? Um, you
Mm.
know, so it does seem to imply, I think, that there is some sort of connective tissue between these things, and it all becomes very complex and contradictory very quickly.
Yeah, and you're just cementing what everyone else is saying to me on all my other interviews, that these are all weird things. They could be all the same thing, but it's likely that they are separate phenomenon that just overlap heavily or interact heavily with each other.
Right. That's part of the reason I think a lot of talk of interdimensional things is gaining a lot of traction. And in fact, most people I talk to now don't really ascribe to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They tend to think that whatever is we're interacting with is interdimensional. And there's a certain parsimony to that, in the sense that a lot of these side effects, other characteristics that we notice as similarities, perhaps that's the way that these things manifest in our reality. So they're kind of all coming from the same place, but they're not all the same thing. Just
Mm.
like if I were to go to another dimension and bring a pencil and a hat, the pencil and the hat aren't me, but they come from the same place. So maybe I don't know.
No, I don't think anyone knows, and if they do, they're not telling us, the sods.
Right.
Now, interesting that you mentioned earlier about the AI. Currently, everything's leaning towards that, and presumably you've heard the fact that the alien greys, the small ones, are presumably AI
Mm,
beings or
yeah.
drones, whatever we want to call them. Thoughts
Yeah,
on
that
that?
yeah, that idea's been out there for a while.
Mm.
And the idea that, well, it's one of the stumbling blocks that a lot of people have pointed out for the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is why do these things look like us or look so similar to us?
Similar, yeah,
Because
yeah.
the gray specifically, even though, so they're the incidence of gray aliens has probably been exaggerated and has probably been influenced by popular culture. There's no shortage of UFO occupants that resemble just normal human beings. Um, but uh, but if we go with the assumption that the grays are alien type number one A, um, or even the human being question too, why do these things look so much like us? And people have proposed a lot of different ideas. They've said that maybe we are literally related to them somehow, and sort of this panspermia idea, either directed
Mm.
panspermia or coincidental panspermia. People have suggested, I kind of find the second possibility fascinating, the idea that any intelligent life found elsewhere in the universe would look like something on Earth, because the conditions on Earth are the only types of conditions that would generate life. So in other words, you have to, you know, you can't make a fire underwater. So the idea that they would be aquatic is kind of ruled out. That sort of
Yeah.
line of thinking, that Earth-like planets are the only kind of planets that would support life, and they would evolve to look similar to life on Earth. But the other idea, bringing it back to this idea of the Greys being drones or robots or something, is that they kind of are rovers, in the sense that we would build rovers for other planets that are tailor-made to Earth. So yeah, of course they have a biped configuration, and they have eyes and mouths and fingers to manipulate things, because that's the way that we have created our world to get around. So it makes sense that they do the same thing. um so it's an interesting idea. They all seem to sort of behave the same. They all seem to have sort of a hive mind. um and in a lot of these scenarios, you do find this recurring theme of these smaller, shorter worker or drone grays being supervised by a taller gray,
Yeah.
taller entity, which sounds to
The
be
drone
quite a bit.
operator, he is.
Well, it also, what it also sounds like, though. It also sounds like, if you've ever read any folklore regarding fairy kings and fairy queens, they're almost always, they're the ones that are human sized, and the actual fairy underlings are the ones that are shorter. So it's
Mm.
another one of those like 20 parallels that I could draw between these phenomena. Um, but so is the implication that the taller being is the one that is actually organic, and they've fashioned all these other things in their likeness? These ideas the idea of that um seems to be reinforced here and there. You do find allusions to a lack of genitalia or anus, which has made some people say that the Greys consume and excrete through their skin. Another topic that I sort of address a little bit in Trojan Feast, but would also be expected if they're purely, artificial. There's also some of the ideas surrounding the possibility of the Greys as robotic life forms get kind of strange real fast. And I say that as someone who loves the stranger ideas, as you can
Mm.
tell. But there was a researcher named Nigel Kerner, I believe, who discussed the possibility that the Greys are sort of drones, robotic drones that have outlived their creators and are sort of traveling the universe looking for that spark of life that their creators possess to sort of allow them to evolve into something organic. And then
That's
it
an
goes down
interesting
this,
thought train, isn't it, going that way?
yeah, and it goes down this sort of rabbit hole of them collecting souls, and it gets very metaphysical very quickly. So yeah, it's something that I see more popular as we continue down this self-destructive path of relying more on artificial intelligence.
Mm. Yeah. It's a big zone, that one, and if we went down there we could theorize for hours without getting anywhere, really, couldn't we? That's all it would ever be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It would definitely be well, yeah. It's you sort
It's
of
a
go
black
into,
hole for the mind,
yeah. You
essentially.
you end up you end up walking around in circles, is what it
Yes,
is. Yeah.
correct on that one. Okay, so let's get back to our big hairy friend, the old Sasquatch, and your book Where the Footprints End, which is all about Bigfoot. Now, can you tell me what your thoughts on Bigfoot are? Is he a real creature? Is he interdimensional? What is he? Is he a UFO friend? What is he?
Well, they've changed over time. Part of the reason that I gravitated towards Bigfoot as a kid is because it seemed like something that was imminently provable at some point. We could
Mm,
get a body or we could get a captured live specimen. But I think if you end up looking at the Bigfoot stuff for long enough, you start to sympathize with the skeptical argument. Why isn't there concrete proof? Why don't we have a body? People will say things like, outdoorsmen don't often stumble upon bear or cougar carcasses. And it's like, but they have, in the
mm.
history of humankind, they have, and they've been able to take them and,
And we have
so
photos, yes.
yeah, yeah. We have, unambiguous photos of those
Mm,
animals, and Bigfoot always turns out blurry. So I always try to emphasize this. Like my inner 12-year-old would love nothing more than there to be a captured Bigfoot tomorrow. Like, let's do this. This is great. But at the same time, I think if you're looking at this objectively, you have to start to see some of these skeptical arguments, and they have a lot of merit. So where does that leave you if you see the skeptical arguments, but you also have talked to people who are completely sure that what they saw was something strange? Like, where does that leave you? Um, and so I was really slow to come around to the idea that there might be something, you know, I don't want to say spiritual, I don't want to say metaphysical, but something unconventional about Bigfoot. Um, and you know, I I ended up getting a call after my third book, Thieves in the Night. This was around 2018, from Timothy Renner, who I'd known through a shared podcast, and we corresponded some. And Tim says, I want to do the definitive book on high strangeness and Bigfoot, and I want you to be a part of it. And I was like, oh, it's going to take a year off, but okay, I'll do it. So I jumped right into it, and it has proven to be, Tim and I have talked about this. It's both of us, for both of us, it's our most popular book. I think volume one is somewhere at like 580 reviews on Amazon or something like that. So, far more than any of my other work. I guess it just kind of came at the right time, but it does address a lot of these common criticisms for Bigfoot and why they might have some sort of antecedent in folklore. Once you sort of separate yourself from the idea that Bigfoot is an undiscovered primate, it starts to look like a lot of other things. I mean, quite frankly, a lot of the Bigfoot stuff sounds very much like a ghost. The Bigfoot will just snap out of existence. Bigfoot is impervious to weapons fire. And of course, that thing that we say in the title of the book, where the footprints end. Like,
Hmm.
it is astonishing the number of trackways that just end in an open field. Yeah. And then the things that you'll hear from the flesh and blood Bigfooters is that, oh, it just jumped really far. And you're like, my man, there's like 250 feet away from the nearest tree. Like, where did it go?
Hmm.
I think the farthest animals that jump, if memory serves, in the animal kingdom are the klipspringer, which is a type of gazelle, and the snow leopard, which I think max out at like a 50-foot vertical and maybe on a good day 100-foot horizontal. I might have that mixed up, but anyway, it's nothing like going into the middle of the field and just disappearing. And they're like, oh, the
Hmm.
Bigfoot walked on a harder, medium. They moved over to some rocks or something, and that is possibly the case in some examples, but we're talking about like a field full of snow where the tracks just end. And then some people say, oh, Bigfoot brush out their tracks or Bigfoot backtrack. And it's like, okay, it's just kind of getting a little bit silly. And you know, so the idea becomes, do they sort of blink in and out of existence? And this is where the flesh and blood Bigfoot folks get really defensive, and they say things like, well, ghosts don't leave footprints. And a statement like that really showcases how much we need people who are interested in these topics to read aspects of paranormal literature that they're not interested in. Because if they did, they would see that one of the earliest techniques in parapsychology was to spread talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints to appear. I mean, that's ghosts slam doors, ghosts push people and things like that. So it seems to be, if you're interested in these topics and you believe that there's some reality to them, it seems to be that our entire model for what is physical and non-physical is flawed. If you look at something like uh, psi phenomena, which there's great laboratory work, the work of Dean Radin and Daryl Bim and scores of others. I would put Rupert Sheldrake in there as well. There are some laboratory experiments that have undergone extremely rigorous controls and have illustrated that there is a statistically significant possibility that psi phenomena exist. The mental interacting with the physical world in
Physical,
some
yeah.
way. So there, I don't have much time for the ghosts don't leave footprints argument. And once you realize that, like, okay, well, something can be perhaps at once physical and non-physical, then it kind of opens up an entire realm of speculation. So Bigfoot kind of looks like a ghost. Bigfoot, quite frankly, resembles some fairy folklore. Yeah, I know it sounds completely counterintuitive that a giant hairy creature would look like a little pixie or a little person wearing, overalls and a hat. But if you look at some of the modern fairy sightings, there are stories of little people that look like little hairy apes. There's even some allusions to some fairy faces appearing simian. What's more is there's an argument to be made that the wild man archetype is sort of a variation of that same fairy idea. And there was a there was a very common um, folkloric figure in the British Isles known as the Wadwos or the Woodwoes. Is kind of related to Odin and Dionysus and the Green Man, but it was a tall, hairy, wild man that was sort of categorized as a fairy. But it even gets more granular than that. I find this next bit fascinating because it's something that you see from time to time in Bigfoot circles, where there's a discussion of Bigfoot sneaking into stables and braiding horses' manes at night, which I know
That's
sounds
a weird
absolutely
one.
it sounds absolutely absurd. I know, but I have heard stories of at least one Russian researcher who was watching, um, who was looking for the Almas, the Russian variation on Bigfoot, and actually supposedly saw this exact same thing happen, where the Bigfoot goes into a stable and braids the horse's hair. I think that I do think that there's a lot of misidentification in this case of people who just put their horses up at night and don't brush their hair out and it wakes up with tangles. But some of the photos I've seen of these so-called braids are really compelling. And, I hear about this a lot in like sort of big sky country, that sort of like Montana, Wyoming sort of area. of people finding their horses' manes braided. I've also heard about it in Western North Carolina some. But I say all that because it sounds so silly. But if you look at some of the older fairy texts, like I can think of at least one example from Devon in the 1700s, where the exact same phenomenon, going out to the stable and finding your horse's mane braided, was attributed to fairy folk. Maybe it was pixies, I can't remember, but it's the exact same thing, just sort of transposed to a different entity. And if you go back through the literature, you also find it blamed on witches or even the goddess Diana. So setting aside what that really is and what's really happening, it's interesting to me how we adapt to the phenomenon as well. Like, okay, well, we don't believe in fairies and pixies anymore, so we're going to put this anomaly, we're going to transpose this anomaly to something that we do find believable, like Bigfoot. And that's not the extent of the similarities that you can make there, but that's just one example that shows you how a lot of the same attributes are applied to these things time and time again. And is that our fallibility, or is that the way that the phenomenon adapts? I don't know.
I don't know either. It's a weird one. I've never heard of that horse braiding thing before. Makes me want to look into it myself because I find it fascinating. Also very strange. So your book about the Bigfoot then, what did you look at primarily? What did you look at all these things like it was a physical being, and did you look at cases of people who said they saw physical beings, like the I can't remember the case now. Patterson Gimli, is it?
Patterson, Gimlin, yeah, stuff like that. I
Yeah.
mean, so what Tim and I discovered, we discovered a couple things. First of all, like, I think I even said, because I wrote the introduction, I even said, the point of this book is not to make a case for Bigfoot as being real, because like there are dozens of other books that sort of make that case. This is sort of like for people who are already familiar with the Bigfoot literature and the Bigfoot evidence, to sort of look at a different angle. So we did spotlight that, and I think some people have even accused us of cherry picking the data, but at the same time, this angle on Bigfoot goes so underreported. I mean, there are numerous stories that you have from former people who were involved with organizations like the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, who said that there was basically a policy of, if you get a story that involves anything paranormal or supernatural, toss it in the waste bin.
Yeah, that's no good.
Yeah, and that's my thing. Like, if you say, okay, I believe you, you saw a big monkey man walk across the road, I believe you. Oh wait, it turned into a ball of light. Okay, we're gonna step back and say that you're crazy. That seems so intellectually dishonest to me. So there was a little bit of that. We also discovered that there are a lot of times where cases sort of get, as Timothy put it, weird washed, where a lot of the strangeness sort of gets omitted, the sins of omission. I mean, a famous example of this is the Ape Canyon attack in Washington. I believe it was in the 1930s. But the story that you'll hear, put forth in a lot of cryptozoology books, are that that there were these miners who were trapped in a cabin, and they basically had a siege on their cabin from several Bigfoot, and they shot some, and there were hands that were hairy that were reaching through the cabin. And like you've seen this, it's been reenacted on many cryptozoology programs. But they leave out some crucial details. They leave out the fact that one of the primary witnesses, Fred Beck, seems to have been, a spiritualist, quite frankly. He claimed that he had a pencil manifest into his hand at just the right time when he needed one. At the Ape Canyon site, he encountered a sort of ghostly girl around the Ape Canyon site as well. The miners were there at their claim because they had been guided there by a white arrow in the sky and Fred Beck's spirit guide, and the mine was named the Vander White Mine. So yeah, even in the more conventional stories that you hear, there does seem to be a there does seem to be these sort of odd outliers that I would argue are sins of omission, because people are trying so hard to make this case for Bigfoot being a flesh and blood creature that they don't want to be associated with any of the strangeness. But the more you look at these cases, the more you find this sort of trend that Timothy and I noticed, which was that the people who have very brief sightings, or the people who have like one sighting, tend to believe that they're dealing with an animal. People who are hunters who see one in the woods, or something that's a one-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk to people who claim long-term interactions with Bigfoot, the people that the community has since called habituators because they believe they have Bigfoot on their property, start to get lots of weird stories. You get stories about strange people lurking about their property, who disappear. You get stories about um, game cameras malfunctioning. You get stories about orbs of light in the woods. That's a very common one. And the Bigfoot community is finally coming around and saying that, yeah, we went to this research site or that research site, and we didn't see Bigfoot, but we did see these strange balls of light in the forest.
Hmm.
And it really gives you pause as to what we're dealing with here. Now, there is a way to have your cake and eat it too, and I think this example will probably make a lot of sense to you since you've spoken with Mike. Um, if you talk to Mike Cleland, he doesn't deny that owls exist, right? He like
Yeah,
there are
they are real.
there are flesh and blood. Yeah, the owls are what they seem, right?
That's right.
There are flesh and blood owls that do all those bird things, right? But the phenomenon also seems very fond of adapting or adopting rather, the owl as a symbol, perhaps as a mask somehow. So maybe there is a population of large hairy hominids that we haven't recognized officially, and that's just another one of these guises that the phenomenon, whatever it is, seems to be fond of. I think that is a possibility. At the same time, once you start looking at Bigfoot as a wild man archetype, for me, it makes a lot of things fall into place. And that's sort of last I spoke with Timothy, that was his stance, is that um, the Bigfoot is an expression of the wild man archetype, the which manifests in a lot of different ways. It manifests as strange sounds in the forest. It manifests as strange smells. It manifests as all sorts of things. But the rarest and most dramatic form that it manifests as is a full blown, for lack of a better term, apparition of a hairy person.
Hmm. It's an odd one, this archetype direction, because that's where Mike tends to take it down. When I spoke to him, he was all about the archetypes. And I
Yeah,
almost
and
don't
it's
like that one, but it is what it is.
well, it kind of, I do understand the impulse to not like it,
Hmm.
because it does sound like a hand wave. It sounds like we're explaining something by saying archetype and then moving on. The way that I look at archetypes are as the source code of the universe. You're sort of peering into that, because a lot of these things, the UFO stuff especially, and the near death experience stuff especially, but I would argue a lot of these different experiences, including Bigfoot experiences, do seem to challenge our basic notions of what reality is. So it seems like, if I had to put an analogy on it, it does seem like there is some sort of mechanism that there are mechanisms that we don't often perceive, but we are allowed to perceive from time to time. And sometimes, you know, you get in that very matrix like fashion a little flash of deja vu, or you might get a synchronicity. But sometimes you get something that is very, very confronting, like a giant ape man. Again, it's asking a lot to go down that path, but I have become skeptical of a lot of the materialist answers for a lot of these things, like the big monkey in the woods or the little green scientist from another planet.
Hmm. It makes me rethink things, doesn't it? Because a lot of people are going the way you suggested and Mike suggested. And not that I'm stuck in
Yeah,
my ways, because I actually like
no,
exploring
and
every avenue.
I hope I conveyed that I completely understand the
Yeah.
hesitancy to go in that direction, because it asks us again. It asks us to confront some things that we just aren't comfortable confronting, like the barrier between physical and non-physical, the barrier between fact and fiction. But if we are dealing with these things that sort of adapt to our expectations, then it would make sense that they are somehow tied into imagination and storytelling and things like that. I mean, you can find this a couple of times in the UFO literature where a trope or something that we consider a trope now um, has its beginnings in fiction, or in a short story or in a scientific story. There's a UFO researcher by the name of Martin Kottmeyer who does a great job tracing down the origins of these things, and things like electronics malfunctions with UFOs first appeared in fiction. They first appeared in some of the pulp magazines and stuff. But now it's just a part of the phenomenon. So is the phenomenon reacting to us, or are these stories somehow being brought to life? I don't know, but
It's chicken and egg, that thing, isn't it?
it really is. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would sort of push back against an assumption like that to a degree, because if you look at, of course, UFOs interfering with electronics wasn't reported before electronics, right?
Naturally.
But you would find things like ghosts interfering with candles, or there's a classic case of, I believe it was in Suffolk, of a black fairy dog or a black hound, one of these hellhounds that made a clock stop inside a church. So like you do see that sort of motif prefigured, but at the same time, there definitely does seem to be an interplay between the fictions that we tell and the stories that we get back from people. I mean, one of the best examples is the fact that reports of the gray aliens, you can kind of see some earlier examples here and there, but after Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and especially after Communion, Whitley Strieber's Communion,
Yes, definitely that one.
Reports just skyrocket of that image. So again, is it people making stuff up? I don't know. I've talked to some of these people, and they, there was one woman I talked to at a festival who was a social worker, and she said, "You can't tell anybody who I am, but this is what I saw." And she goes on to describe how she saw a cat person one night. I'm like, completely rational human being,
She wasn't at a Comic-Con or anything, was she?
No, she wasn't. But there's always this sort of default response that people are quote unquote crazy, or people are hallucinating, or they're mistaken, or they're liars and hoaxers, and I tend to think that we overestimate the numbers of liars and hoaxers.
Oh, completely. Not everyone. There's so many millions of reports of these things.
Yeah.
Not everyone's a gimp.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks are genuine, and even even the people who are struggling with mental illness, like that casts the whole thing in a new light, because you're making fun of them and they're struggling with a mental illness. Like, that's real dodgy territory for me. And even if it's a mundane, even if they're have a clean bill of mental health and they just misidentified something but were terrified by it, well, the trauma is still real. So that's why I tend to treat experiencers with respect rather than sort of heap derision upon them, because number one, they're not really getting support from anywhere else, and number two, I would rather be kind to a hoaxer and also be kind to nine other
non-hoaxers,
non-hoaxers, than to be cruel to 10 non-hoaxers, or 9 hoaxers and one non-hoaxer. Yeah.
Oh, I completely agree on that one. I think my favorite ever Bigfoot case goes in both directions, which I can't remember the name of it. I can give you the outline facts, and then you'll be able to tell me.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was in a field where a guy shot at a Bigfoot in the tree line or hedge line. Says he hit it a couple of times, and then there was a UFO, and it blinked out. Something to do with a sheriff as well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So
do you remember that one?
Yep, absolutely. This is a famous, probably the most famous shared UFO Bigfoot sighting. Researcher Stan Gordon has chronicled a lot of these of this 1970s UFO Bigfoot flap, as they call these outbreaks of phenomenon in Pennsylvania. And Gordon was actually one of the first researchers, or if not the first researcher, to respond on the scene of this sighting. And as he tells the story, or as the story was told, and it kind of gets a little bit difficult because there were some pseudonyms involved and some dates got changed to protect people's identity and things like that. But Gordon has authenticated a lot of these details. There was a large red glowing ball the size of like a barn that was seen on a farm property in Pennsylvania, and it came down to rest in a field. By the time family members, I think somewhere like 5 or more, if memory serves, by the time they arrived on the scene, the ball of light, this gigantic ball of light, I believe it snapped out of existence. Although it left a glow afterward that even police officers said you could read a newspaper by how bright the area was. But it snapped out of existence, and along with this, there were these two hairy ape men, these Bigfoot, that were walking a fence line. The I believe it was I believe the two men who had uh, rifles had them loaded with tracer rounds, so they could actually see that they were indeed hitting these creatures, and or they could see where the bullets were going. And when they hit one of the creatures, there was a sound as if like a coin had been dropped into some water, like it was like a plop, like a watery plop,
Weird.
and the thing winked out of sight. And the story gets even weirder because the father of the family, I believe, um, ended up having a convulsion on the side of the UFO landing. And when he came out of the convulsions, he reported these apocalyptic visions. There was sort of an insinuation that he might be sort of the chosen one to save the world, which again is something that you see in a lot of the UFO stories as well. And then, afterwards, he experienced what appears to be some degree of clairvoyance, predicting plane crashes and where birds would land, which is kind of like it seems like it could be left up to chance. But he also had a visit from two characters that said that they were from the military that never came back, and there are no official records of, which kind of sounds like a Men in Black thing because they showed him some photos of UFOs and Bigfoot. So it's one of those stories that combines all sorts of different aspects of this stuff into this absurdist soup. And the one way to approach it is to say, okay, well, the Bigfoots were from the UFO and they came from a planet of Bigfoots. And I don't know, once you start introducing that once you start introducing the consciousness element with these visions and whatnot, it really does start to me to sound like something metaphysical going on. That is drawing upon, I'm going to say it again, all these archetypes, and presenting them at once in one encounter. But I don't know. Yeah, I can't. There's no rational explanation that I can think for that. But according to Stan Gordon, he interviewed everybody, and the family was rational
Mm.
and sober and amazed. So
I remember loving that story. And another thing I want to quickly interject here: Stan Gordon has got an amazing voice.
he does. He really does.
I,
If you,
yeah,
give me like one or two words, and I know exactly who it is. And he's a really nice. I've had a chance to speak with him once, and he seems to be a very nice fellow as well. Yeah.
which is lovely. Yeah, that story's always stuck with me. Um, if I had to put a pound coin, right, it's a massive bet, I know. If I had to put it on flesh and blood creature or somehow interdimensional, whatever you want to call it, tied with UFO somehow, I'd actually go that way rather than flesh and blood myself.
Yeah, and what I like about that is that again, it just addresses all those skeptical complaints. Yeah. Um, but it addresses them by sounding even crazier. But that's a
Oh
place
hell
that I'm
yeah!
fine with. That's a place that I'm fine with being. Yeah. So yeah, so
And
that ended up being a 2 volume set. We wanted to write one book, but it just got too long, so we split it in two.
magic, magic. Right, I want to get into the final book that I want to discuss here today, which is Ecology of Souls, and this is the one that makes me go whoa the most. So you make the case for UFOs being part of the death process or after the death state.
Well,
Have I got that right?
there's some sort of connection there. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Obviously, I speculate here and there throughout that book, but I'd always been really bothered, um, in a sort of perplexed way by a statement that was made by Whitley Strieber's wife,
I
Anne.
know the one you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Whitley Strieber, for anybody who doesn't know, is probably the world's most famous alien abductee. He wrote Communion and is um, sort of a controversial figure in the sense that some people completely don't believe it and some people do believe it. But regardless of where you fall on that, Anne was answering a lot of correspondence in the wake of Communion because Communion was a huge success, and they were getting a lot of letters from people who were saying things like, "I can't believe that you experienced this because I have too, and I don't know." A lot of the times I talk to people, and they just want to talk to somebody. They're not looking for answers. They just want to know that there's somebody there who will listen to them. And that was seems to be the case for this. And Anne was compiling a list of similar of just trends that she had noticed, right? And one of the ones that really stuck with Whitley that he's mentioned in several of his books was this, referring to the alien abduction scenario, has something to do with what we call death. And that's such a haunting phrase that it kind of just
Mm.
sticks with you. So I always had that in the back of my mind. Then I, have heard these stories, which I wouldn't say are common, but they happen often enough that they should be treated as a legitimate subset of these encounters, where people encounter dead loved ones aboard UFOs in their abductions. Like it happens. And then there's also this aspect of the trickster that we've talked about. The trickster as an archetype has a lot of shared attributes. It's the guardian of the threshold. It's a disruptor to the norms. But a lot of there is a connection between tricksters and these figures that we call psychopomps. The ones that we most famously think of are like the Grim Reaper or the Egyptian Anubis, or there's an indigenous Australian one called Barnum Beer. But everyone is familiar with this idea of this character that leads you into the afterlife. But the Greek one was Hermes, and Hermes is like one of the most famous tricksters, and Hermes is also a psychopomp. So there was that connection that always sort of bucked me. And then finally, that I've referenced before, that's been very influential to me, Jacques Vallée's 1969 Passport to Magonia makes a very cogent case for connecting UFOs to the older fairy literature. But there's kind of something that gets left on the table in that discussion and doesn't get addressed, which is the fact that prior to the rise of things like spiritualism and theosophy at the at the late end of the 19th century, people in communities, I would argue worldwide, but especially in Western Europe, oftentimes related fairies not to nature elementals or any of these sort of newer ideas, but they related them to the human dead. A lot of the stories that I mentioned about fairies keeping you in their realm if they give you food or drink in a Trojan feast, the person who warns you, hey, don't eat or drink anything here because you'll be stuck here with the fairies, the person in those narratives is oftentimes a deceased loved one or a deceased neighbor who's somehow now here keeping court with the fairies. So there's always been this connection. And if you sort of use the transitive property, if the dead were fairies and the fairies were aliens, then like, does that mean that the UFO occupants
Mm.
are the human dead? So that was kind of the basic question that I just wanted to look at. I just wanted to look at UFOs and the dead and see what the connection was. And this thing just kind of blows up and grows larger and gets out of your control the more you look at it. And so I started finding these connections to the dead throughout everything, not just fairies and UFOs, but certain cryptids. Obviously, the near-death experience that's been talked about extensively in the work of Kenneth Ring, who said, hey, near-death experiences and UFO contact often look the same. Um, Psychedelics, the number of entheogens in psychedelics used by indigenous populations, the number of those that say that these things put you in contact with the world of the dead or the world of the spirits was really startling to me. And people receive communications from the dead in altered states of consciousness all the time. Um, you know, these ancient monuments, a lot of these ancient monuments, both in the New World and the Old World, that indigenous populations in North America built and in indigenous populations in Europe built, but kind of everywhere, often have these ties to the dead. Like even if they didn't start as sites for burial, they became sites for burial. And so it seemed that like everything that we talk about in the supernatural has some sort of relationship to the dead. To say nothing of these sort of fun and superficial ideas that maybe Bigfoot is the ghost of one of our ancestors, an Australopithecus or Gigantopithecus or
Mm.
something, or that Nessie is the ghost of a plesiosaur or something. Um, there's just all these different connections that you can find throughout this stuff before you even get to the UFO topic. So I started writing it, and there's the Ecology of Souls has a very pretentious subtitle, which is a new mythology of death and the paranormal. But if I'm being charitable to myself, like it became so expansive that it really did sort of it does present a holistic way to look at these phenomena. And I don't know if it's accurate. I don't know if it's objective, but it works. The fandom communities call things headcanon. Like that's what I'm just going to choose to believe in my head. it's a good headcanon for me when dealing with the paranormal, and it allows me to reconcile a lot of outliers and things that I didn't really know what to make of. So that was kind of the origins of it, and that's kind of what the project ended up being, and just tons of nooks and crannies and insights and different directions you can take that I sort of tried to address along the way.
Now, do you think this particular research into this book exploded your mind the most of all the books you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it was because it did have a chance to provide an answer. Again, maybe not the right answer, but an answer from some outliers. I mean, a good example of this is the dog man phenomenon. I'm not sure how much you're familiar with this, but
Yeah, I know a little bit about him.
yeah, people describe this, and you listen to these stories, and they're kind of goofy, right? You know,
Mm.
but here I am saying believe witnesses, right? So how do I? What do you do with that, Josh? Like, how can you feel that way? You know, I don't think you're ever going to capture kill a dog man, but like, what are people seeing in these encounters? And once you start to look at this through again that lens of psychopomps, like psychopomps can be deities, they can be ancestors, they can be folk figures, they can be natural phenomena like the sun and moon, and they can oftentimes, and this is truly a universal, be animals. And of those animals, the three animals that are often times cited as psychopomps are dogs, horses, and birds, which, as just so happens, are the three animals most closely associated with shamanism. Again, a community shaman or medicine man or whatever term you want to use was oftentimes a psychopomp themselves, a living psychopomp to sort of help people make that transition to the afterlife. So you've got dogs as a psychopomp, and dog man being something that seems to exist. Again, if you take the angle of souls, not just about the afterlife, but this angle of soulcraft, you know, I mentioned earlier how there was this belief that sometimes we had these polypsychic existences, that we had multiple souls within us. You know, depending on your tradition, those might be able to wander in states of trance or in states of dreaming or any altered state of consciousness. And sometimes those souls might have zoomorphic qualities. They might look like a certain animal. You'll find this, you know, a lot through the Scandinavian texts, which had their own brand of polypsychism. And that's probably what was happening if there was some sort of reality to werewolves, which I know is probably some people have already probably lost at this point. But if there was any reality to werewolves, I suspect that's what it was, is that, you know, someone's soul, either through the act of magical practice or just by merit of the fact that they happened to have their soul wander when they were sleeping, would rove about the countryside in the form of a wolf. And, you know, if you shot at it, that injury would be mirrored on your own body. We have examples in stigmata where it seems that, you know, not the non-physical can inflict wounds on the physical body. We also have examples of people, you know, getting punched in their dreams and waking up with a mouthful of blood and broken teeth. So there, again, the non-physical physical thing seems to be a false dichotomy. So okay, well, now we're starting to make sense of Dogman, and that's an example of one of those outliers that I finally was able to say, okay, I don't know if this is what's going on, but it kind of works and it kind of fits into this broader theory really nicely.
Are you dog man when you sleep? So what you're saying?
I wish, you know, man. I am supernatural kryptonite. I think that sometimes I have had some really interesting stuff happen, but nothing, some kind of ghosty stuff and some good synchronicities. But I've never seen anything. Well, I've had some Bigfoot adjacent stuff, but I've never seen an entity in the sense of Bigfoot or little people or UFO occupants or dog man. So unfortunately, no.
You haven't seen it, but you are a dog man. That's I'm putting it down to that.
Yes, guys. Yeah, yeah. I see it in my dreams. So
yeah. So with the case of, you said where people were brought on board UFO crafts and they saw dead people. Now that could be the trickster, in this case, projecting that person so that you feel familiar and therefore calm down or whatever, or excited. Right. Or it could be that is a dead person there, blah, blah, blah. Have you got any stories that you could share about that? Some I might not have heard, maybe.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's the most common rebuttal that you'll find from the ufologists who believe that these are strictly nuts and bolts craft. That there is somehow, through, again, it's magical thinking. Like, you can't get away from magical thinking in the paranormal. You find that they'll say that it's a screen memory, again, like that explains anything. They never really say whether it's a technology that allows them to project this image into your mind. They never say whether it's telepathic control, but that's the party line for traditional ufologists. And for me, I'm like, well, we're already in this quasi magical realm. Let's just say that it either is the dead person or that they're projecting it into someone's mind. But yeah, I was going to go down to Rice University to Fondren Library because they have all of that correspondence from the Strebers that they received after communion. But the pandemic sort of made that not a possibility. But I did still, even still, just working with the resources that I had on hand, I still was able to find quite a few really interesting examples of those. One of my favorites, because it seems to imply a degree of corroboration, was that sometime around 1963 in Massachusetts, there was an abductee who claimed that she would often travel accompanied by two gray aliens to this sort of through a tunnel, right? So we've got one of those afterlife near-death experience movies right there. Through a tunnel to this crystalline pyramid city. You do see those sort of gleaming cities in some of the near-death experience encounters as well. But on one of the occasions, she spoke with a couple of people and who were there with her because they were all also human beings that had also been abducted. And one of them, she was able to remember the name, and the name was Ingrid Swinson. When she told this story to UFO researchers, the UFO researchers, to their credit, were able to track down someone by that name. And as it turns out, even though the primary witness in this case, lived in Massachusetts, Ingrid Swinson lived in South Dakota. They had never met, but Ingrid Swinson was also dead. So it provides a level of sort of confirmation in that example. If it's to be believed, we don't know how shoddy the research practices were, but it does seem to suggest that there are a lot of examples of people who see the dead whom they don't know, right? So they don't recognize them. You don't recognize it as your dead Uncle Bob or your dead Aunt Gertrude. But they'll be told that these people are dead, or the dead will tell them that they're dead in these alien abductions. But once you entertain the idea that you're not going to recognize if someone is dead or not unless you knew them in life or unless they say something, then what are we dealing with in these cases where people see other abductees? What are we dealing with in these cases where people see the UFO occupants as appearing human? Like, are these the dead somehow involved in this scenario? But there are plenty of other examples. I would say that it's much more common for people to see dead folks that they recognize. And it's interesting too, because it's not just aboard the craft, but it's also times like people who are in just periods of heavy UFO activity where they will see the dead, not necessarily aboard the craft, but also like they'll see them on the street or on their property, or think they catch them out of the glimpse of their eye. It's also tied very much into this sort of post-abduction phenomenon of enhanced psi effects and enhanced poltergeist effects. People tend to see ghosts after a UFO encounter, just like they tend to after near-death experiences. But it's just, and again, like, this is where you really run into some big, heavy questions, because it's like, do we go to other planets after we die? Like, I can't entertain that. I also have a hard time entertaining the idea that there are ghosts piloting physical nuts and bolts spacecraft, although that idea is shockingly old. You can find references to that as a possible explanation for the UFO phenomenon back to like the 1950s, I believe. So it just leads you in a lot of different strange directions. And once you see how many different ways you can take it, it's like, oh, I understand why Josh wrote another 2-volume book, because there's just so much ground to cover. And if you want to be thorough, that's my obsessive compulsive disorder coming out. Then yeah, it ends up being really big and entertaining a lot of different possibilities.
Then I will know you will have gone down this branch of the tree, or the branch of the investigation.
I'm going to be embarrassed if I didn't now.
You're bound to have done this one because you'll have thought of it. So is it that alien abductions, right, the Greys or whatever, are taking people to a next plane of existence, another dimension, if you will, and that's the dimension at which dead reside, yeah, when they've moved on to the next plane? That's where I see it in my mind.
Yeah, and that sort of makes you reevaluate like what these things are, what these intercessory third parties are. Like,
Hmm.
there's some people who will fall back on that reductive Christian interpretation that they're angels or demons. That's not where, again, ecology of souls implies that there's a lot of entities filling a lot of niches, right? It's not just good and bad and that's it. There's a lot of different things. But yeah, that's why I brought in this idea of psychopomps. There are a lot of comparisons that you can draw between psychopomps and UFOs in general. I mean, if you think about the UFO as an object of study, it's a transportation obsessed phenomenon. Where did they come from? Where are they going? Why are
Hmm.
they here? Or where are they taking me? Those sort of questions. And in addition to those other psychopomps that I listed, one of the most prominent, again, universal, like I hesitate to say universal in some cases, but this is one of those examples that you can truly call it universal because you see it on so many continents. One of those universal symbols of the psychopomp is the boat, because, that was, again, a lot of these psychopomp ideas, they incorporate transportation, right? Horses, birds can go places human beings can't. Dogs are loyal, so it's a little bit different. But if you think about, Karin's ferry across the river Styx,
Sticks.
those
That's
sorts
it.
of
I was going to
ideas.
mention that.
A lot of times you'll see these deities that are psychopomps are also uh, gods and goddesses or patron saints. In the case of something like Saint Christopher, are also they also serve travelers. So it's this idea of travel and transportation. So boats are a really common psychopomp motif. Viking burials, which didn't necessarily happen like the way they did in the films, but you'll also find, people buried in boats in the case of the Norse, in the case of the Egyptians, in ancient China, there have been some burials that were exhumed that used boats as coffins. You'll find this in island
And
Southeast
chariots as
Asia.
well. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, same idea. So what is the UFO if not a vessel to another world? Like it's the same concept. So it makes sense that we would sort of bring the dead into that concept. And I would argue that as we continued to disenchant and discover our world, we found that no, there isn't really an underworld under our feet, and no, the land of the dead doesn't lie just beyond that mountain range or just beyond the horizon. We sort of transposed a lot of those beliefs to the final frontier, if you will. And that's why you see this sort of resonance between ideas of the dead and ideas of the UFO. And this was something that only relatively recently did the UFO subject matter sort of distance itself from the dead. If you look back through the contactee literature, there are numerous allusions of these crafts taking people to other planets after they die. The child of Howard Minger tragically died of cancer, and lights were seen around the time of his death. And he said, "Don't worry, Daddy. These are the beings from Orion or wherever it is about to take me." There are a lot of allusions to people familiar with the UFO topic speaking in those terms. UFO, and this we just sort of acquire a laundry list of correspondences. Like one of the biggest hot spots to see UFOs is cemeteries and graveyards. Like, why is that? Are people just more contemplative, or is there some sort of connection there? We spoke earlier about aliens harvesting souls. There have been some sightings of UFOs like shining lights in cemeteries, and it's like, what are they doing there? But if you also look back even further than just the contactee area, you'll find this UFO death connection. There are numerous, I should say, indigenous tribes in North America that believe that the star people come and take you to the afterlife. Sometimes this is like a literal bodily abduction of your physical form, and once you go with them, you live another life on another planet. So
Hmm.
it's there's this term that's used in religious study called Prisca Theologia, which is this idea of trying to find like the earliest religious impulse that humankind has had. And my argument is that the Prisca Euphologia is entirely spiritual. Like we first understood this as a spiritual phenomenon, probably tied to the dead. It's only relatively recently that we distanced it from that and really became entrenched in the extraterrestrial hypothesis.
Now, I watched a Joe Rogan podcast the other day where he had, I'm sure it was Jeremy Corbell and what's his face on, George
George
Knapp.
Knapp. Mm-hmm.
And they talked about this collection of souls bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you probably the biggest question that anyone can ever ask, and it's almost impossible for you to answer, but I want to see if you can try
Okay.
to build it up.
Okay.
Which is to say, how do you think the universe of the soul is structured? Meaning, do you think we live as a soul in a realm up here and we are coming down to Earth for a
Hmm.
purpose? Where do aliens fit in with that structure? All that sort of stuff. Can you
Okay.
build it?
Now I've put some thought into this. So there are very few hills which I will die upon in the paranormal. I'm not going to stand here and say that all UFOs are genuinely anomalous or anything like that. The hills that I will die upon are probably number one, that psi is real because there is such a good history of laboratory controlled experiments. The second was probably the near death experience. There's a lot of really compelling stories, and I'm sure you've heard of people learning about the passage of other relatives, and they come back. The first thing that they say when they come back to life is like, you know, cousin Bobby is dead. And they're like, no, cousin Bobby's fine. And they call the cousin Bobby, and cousin Bobby doesn't answer. Like,
Mm.
so you see a lot of like confirmation in that regard. And the third is reincarnation. There's a lot of great research out there done by Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker. One of those gentlemen is deceased. I can't remember off the top of my head. Forgive me. At the University of Virginia. Of course, you know, reincarnation does open up a lot of questions. You know, are children drawing upon the lives of someone else, or is it literally the same soul in another body? But there does seem to be something to the reincarnation thing. And reincarnation is a theme that you cannot get away from in a lot of the UFO literature. You know, there are people who talk about their past lives on alien planets. There are people who talk about just their past lives here on Earth that are sort of drawn out during the hypnotic regressions that became so popular amongst alien abduction researchers. Whether or not hypnotic regression is good for that, we'll set that aside for the moment. But what I'm getting at is that there's a theme of rebirth and the sort of stewardship of lives that somehow is tied up in the UFO thing. There are lots of stories of pre-birth memories. Another reason I embarked on this project is because I heard these stories of pre-birth memories, and I'm like, ay, what does that even mean? But people who claim to have remember being a ball of light aboard a distant spaceship or another planet with these beings. It's like, okay, so how do you, like, if you were going to formulate a hypothesis, what is it? And I've come to the only thing that the thing that I can figure out that seems to be uh the best fit, and again, entirely speculative, um, is that these beings are water bearers from the well of souls. So
Well,
you
can
know,
you explain that?
yeah, and I do like the water analogy. So one of the things that when you talk to people about reincarnation that they always push back on is they're like, okay, well, if reincarnation is real, then how come there are more people on Earth than there ever have been before? You know, why is the Earth the most populated it's ever been? And my response to that is, well, how many waves can be on an ocean? You know, there's no real limit. You know, there are these concrescences of things coming together and then they diminish. And I kind of suspect that the whole of life energy is like that. And I don't necessarily think that it has to be a one-to-one reincarnation. Like, I don't think that if you were Napoleon in a past life that means 100% of you was Napoleon, right? I think maybe
Mm.
5% of you is Napoleon. But you know, we die and it all gets mixed up in the soup, and then we come back out as another concrescence of a wave, just like a wave is made up of parts of a lot of other different waves on the ocean. So and again, continuing with that metaphor, it's you know, this idea that there's sort of like a water cycle that we see. You know, these waves, this wave of, or this mass of moisture gets taken up into the air, made up of constituents from 1,000 different places across the globe, and then falls to Earth and rejoins the river and goes back out to the sea. The role that the entities, whatever they might be, that we call aliens, might play. Because there's plenty of allusions to this through literature, which I'm not going to go back and talk about right now, because that's why I
Mm.
wrote the book. But that they sort of oversee that reincarnation process. There's, I believe, Strieber was told once, either by one of the people he spoke to or by the visitors themselves, that we recycle souls.
Yeah.
There was another friend of his, Laurie Barnes, who was sort of experiencing an encounter with being, I believe it was one of those short blue entities that Strieber claimed to have encountered. And she had this look of revulsion, and the being said, "My dear, one day you'll look just like us." So there's this idea that that they're somehow overseeing that process. And that's kind of where I fall with the human alien hybrid program that you hear talked about so much in abduction literature. Is it the combination of these two opposite things for which we really don't have a lot of great genetic evidence for, or is it sort of a metaphor for the creation of life, this sort of gathering together from separate places into one being individual that's placed here on Earth, you know? So are these things us in some sense? I don't know. Are they existing outside of the human condition as operators for this gigantic system? Maybe, I don't know. But I think that they do play, it would seem that they play a role in creation, much as the same way, again, going back to the fairy stuff, you'll find allusions to that as well. Fairies as encouragers of things like fertility, or you know, in the later traditions, the idea that they're elementals helping life flourish. Like these same themes keep on running through all of this, and that's kind of, if I had to say that there's a thesis, that's kind of where I end up.
I kind of like it. So they are, and you put me on a new train of thought here, that they are the intermediary between the afterlife, or whatever that plane of his existence, and this reality here, and they help facilitate it.
And that's why I'm really sympathetic to this interdimensional idea. There's a great conversation between the late Brad Steiger, who was an author of All Spooky Things, and Hans Holzer, a prominent ghost hunter. And Steiger says, let me get this right. Steiger says, I always thought that these things, referring to UFO stuff, came from another dimension. And Holzer says, well, how is that any different than the afterlife? And Steiger's like, I don't know. And Holzer's like, yeah, you know. So if you kind of want to think, if you kind of want to couch it as an interdimensional phenomenon, then that seems to be just a modern way of talking about things like afterlives and other worlds and Tir Nanog and Middle Earth and all these other ideas that we've bandied around over the years.
Amazing. I'm going to take that forward, that train of thought. I like it. It's going to set my mind going for a few weeks, let me tell you. Right, now we're almost at the end of our time, because I know we promised 2 hours, but I got one more section to go through with you, but it'll be very quick, so please bear with me if that's okay.
Yeah.
But before I go into this section, I do want to say this. I don't like to be self-referential on any of these podcasts I do, but if you get a chance, by the time this episode of yours comes out, it will have appeared last week. All right, a lady called Lorraine Flaherty, who's a past life regression expert. And she's intertwined with Mike.
Okay.
So they are linked. I won't go into too much, but suffice to say, some of the stuff that came out in that interview blew my mind, and it's all linked with what you're saying.
Interesting.
So you get a lot out of it, I think.
Okay, I'll check it out. I definitely will.
Yeah, it's worth listening to. It's probably, I don't know, blew my mind anyway. Right, so we are going to now enter the Koit Zone. Koit Zone!
Okay.
Now, in the Koit Zone, it's very random because this is more my personality. So I will ask you some questions and you can give as much or as little answer as you want. So let's start with an easy one. Favorite film and why?
It'll take me a minute.
That's okay.
I have so many. It's like
you have 5 seconds. Joking.
Okay. There's an Italian film that I believe it won Best Foreign Film at the Oscars the year it was released, called Cinema Paradiso.
Cinema Paradiso, yes. I know the film. I can't remember watching it, but I do know it. Right. If overnight you no longer had to go to the bathroom as everything magically sealed up and so nothing ever came out, what would you do with your extra time?
Oh my goodness. More of what I'm still doing.
No, that's good. That tells you you're on the right path, then, doesn't it?
Maybe combine it into a nap.
Okay. What are you frightened of?
I'm frightened of disappointing or emotionally harming people that I care about.
Fair play. Fair play. Favorite animal?
You know, my answer as a child was always duck-billed platypus, and for a while it was also the warthog.
Based
That
on the
is
names, though, purely.
no. I mean, the platypus is just such an odd thing, and then the warthog fascination stemmed from this repeated denial. We were going to the zoo, and there was like a new warthog exhibit, and the warthogs were off display, and I was like, "Oh, I'll see it next time." And then for like 4 visits in a row, I wasn't able to see it, so I developed this fascination for warthogs. And so after that, every zoo we went to, I just wanted to go see the warthogs, and I know more about warthogs than probably any animal that. Yeah, it's weird. It's really strange, but it was born out of consecutive denial. Yeah.
Does that mean that on birthdays and Christmas and stuff, you get loads of like warthog statuettes and things?
Oh no, not anymore. Not anymore.
That's not so bad
Yeah,
then.
yeah. I used to though. I used to have warthog hats and warthog shirts. So it's just, I guess I was a weird kid. What can I say?
No, that's fair enough. It's a good reason to start a little fascination. Who would you love to meet?
Oh my goodness. I mean, this is where I have to answer something. Is this living or dead?
Whoever you want, however you want to answer it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, living or dead, I would love to meet John Keel, but he's dead.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, that's a good answer. What food is your downfall?
It changes. But I will say that I have a real soft spot for blue cheese.
That's gross, but that's fair enough. If you like.
I know, yeah, I know. Yeah.
At least it's not pancakes.
Yeah.
Cardboardy pancakes.
Space pancakes.
Yeah. Space pancakes, that's it. What's the worst injury you've ever sustained?
Oh my goodness. Well, the scariest injury I ever sustained, maybe you can kind of see it still. I was kneeboarding behind my mom and dad's pontoon, and the metal clip that goes like this to snap.
Right.
It's supposed to go like that. It only closed like right there. And so when they took off, the metal clip, not being secured, snapped back and hit me right here with all that tension on the rope.
Yeah.
It got tense and then it popped. And it looked like someone had just like slipped their finger underneath my skin, like it was that pronounced and localized. And didn't have a concussion. My grandfather was an old country doctor, and we went to him, and he said, just wake up a couple of times tonight and keep an eye on it. But I think about what that could have done. It could have hit me in the eye. I could be wearing an eye patch right now. It could have hit me in the teeth. Being a brass player, it could have hit me in the lips, it's not the most severe thing, but it would have been kind of devastating to me. I read shortly thereafter about a similar accident where the hook had come back and hit someone in the jugular. And
oh, Christ.
They bled out in the water. Yeah. So in terms of like the impact that it had on me, like long term, it's probably not like the worst in that sense, but in terms of how it could have gone, easily the scariest and the worst. Yeah.
No, that's good. Fair. Well, no, it's not good, clearly, but
it's good that I came out a-okay. So yeah.
Yes, exactly. Have you ever been in a fight?
I've been in some confrontations that have never escalated to a fight. I was always taught by my parents. I've kind of been the same height since like 4th or 5th grade, and I'm like 6'3". So I was always taught, just don't fight because you're too big.
You will destroy them.
There was one occasion, and nowadays, like the person who walks away from the fight as an adult is the one who wins, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So there was an occasion, I believe, in middle school where there was this kid who was just bullying me, and because I sort of had this reputation as being a pacifist, I guess, he knew that he could get away with it until one day I just snapped and he didn't. I didn't throw any punches. I just like got behind him and put him in a chokehold and brought him to the ground. I was just like, just stop. I was like, just please stop. So that's the closest thing to an actual fight like that I've come to. Yeah.
Cool. Where in history would you rather live if not in today's era?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's if I strip away all the considerations of comfort and some of the horrific social conditions of the past, so I want to be really careful about that. I think that it would have been really neat to have lived. Well, see, that's a good question. Is it a time and a place, or just a time? I'm
I've
overthinking
said
this.
where in history, so that could be time and place.
Okay. I think it would have been really interesting to have lived uh in the Wild West on the American frontier. Just the sense of possibilities and the fact that you're kind of coming up on so many marvelous inventions would have been interesting to see.
And if you knew where the gold was,
And
rich
if
as
you
shit.
do I get the benefit of hindsight so I can go?
Yes, you do.
Yeah. Oh, then yeah, absolutely, yeah.
The gold fields. What type of music do you really detest? And I'm putting detesting because I know what type of music you love because it's on your website.
Right, right. Yeah. So I appreciate all music. I really do. Um, and there are obviously outliers in every genre that I can find an entry point into.
Mm-hmm.
And there are good things that I like, and there are bad things that I like, and there are good things that I don't like, and bad things that I don't like. Right. So with all that nuance in there, the really hardcore metal stuff, like I admire a lot of the virtuosity that I hear in some of that, but like when it just feels like someone's yelling at me for minutes on end, I feel attacked or something. You know what I mean? So yeah, I have a lot of friends who are into metal, and like, this is great, and I'm like, I understand why it's great, but I just can't. I just can't. Yeah.
You're the second person to give me that answer, and I've used that question twice. That's
Okay.
the same music that's come out twice. So.
Yeah. When
Right.
it feels like someone's yelling a yawn at me,
Yeah.
I
All that
kind of
stuff.
get, yeah, I kind of just want to get away as quickly as I can. But I
Okay.
understand it, and I appreciate it, and I know that there are lots of variations within that genre. But yeah.
Fair enough. Here's a real Koity question for you. Has anyone famous ever farted in front of you?
No, no.
I really wanted an answer. Yes or no?
I've seen famous people, but I have not detected a famous fart from anyone. No.
Ah, look for that. That could be something for your future.
Yeah, I'll just have to keep a nose out.
Right, I'm going to put on the last question, which is I always end on. What are you currently working on?
I am currently catching up on correspondence. I just released a novel called "Them Old Ways Never Died" that is combines a lot of the different ideas that I've played with. I just wanted to see if I could write a novel, and just waiting to hear feedback from more people on that. But I'm engaged in two other projects that are going to be projects co-authored with some friends of mine, and they're really exciting. I don't know, since they're involved, I don't know how much I can share or overshare. But the next two books are going to be co-authored projects, again in this sort of speculative nonfiction arena. Yep.
No, fair play. Hey, look, Joshua, I'm going to say thanks ever so much for coming on. It's an honour to have you aboard. Great conversation. I left out a lot of stuff I could have gone through, but hopefully maybe we can do that in the future if you can spare the time in the future.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind staying on for 1 minute post me turning this off, I got one final question for you on a personal
Certainly.
level. But for the rest of you watching this, thank you for watching, and see you on the next KoitCast episode. To watch other episodes of KoitCast, or indeed animations I've made, click the image top middle. Click the image top left to download some of my songs, and click the image top right to subscribe to my channel. And make sure you tick that notification bell so you never miss an upload.